Most of our members are between 40 and 60. That's not by accident. It's a really interesting chapter of life where what's happening in your life actually changes, and logically what happens in your body changes as well. Health has become lifestyle, status. It's become a cool conversation to be in for a lot of people. My dad has advanced dementia. I have some genetic predisposition to that, which I found through my diagnostics. And now I can clearly see where I move on the risk profile for Alzheimer's and dementia if I don't commit to sleeping well as much as I can.
They may not be life or death situations, but these are the kinds of insights that I do think that there is value in having. And I think they are the kind of insights that the population level healthcare system doesn't do a good job surfacing.
The longevity philosophy is let's spot these things as early as we can and address them then, because that's the best way to make sure they don't become big problems in the future.
Hi there, I'm Christina Farr, and this is Second Opinion, the podcast that cuts through the noise in digital health to deliver what you actually need to know. We're tackling the topics that matter with brutal honesty and depth through conversations you won't find elsewhere. No talking points, no hype, just clear insights to help you navigate what's really happening at the intersection of health, technology, and biology. Let's dive in. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited about this week's Second Opinion podcast. We've had just a bunch of incredible guests on the pod recently, tackling everything from the future of health insurance to women's health. And now we've got a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about why that is. We have the CEO of a company called Lifeforce. His name is Dugal Bain-Kim. We actually first bonded about our experiences going to bars in London when we were probably teenagers, and it's been kind of a wild ride since. I will say that my fund, Scrub Capital, is invested in Lifeforce. I always want to disclose that upfront, but I think it makes for an even more interesting interview and discussion because I can tell you a little bit about how we got to conviction. So Dugal, with that, thank you so much for joining us on the Second Opinion podcast.
Thanks, Chrissy. Really excited to chat. It's funny how life moves from bars in London to talking about staying healthy and trying to live a long time, but here we are.
And also just that we're sitting here in America as two people who didn't grow up in this country, with both of us with now kind of a career and a passion around the US healthcare system. So I think life just kind of works in funny ways.
Very much so. Yeah, I'm still sort of wrapping my head around being a California native and putting down roots here and trying to do what we can to help folks in this country get better healthcare.
All right, so I'm going to jump right in. And the question I'm going to ask is really, I think, the one that, as we were thinking about making the investment, just really struck me the most. And that's that we have a system where a lot of people do have insurance. It's kind of been the push over the last couple of decades to get more people insured. And yet we've also seen this kind of creation of what I call the shadow healthcare system, which is really this cash pay alternative where people are seeking out healthcare on their own. They're willing to pay for it. And it's a very different style of healthcare, but it's not one that flows through insurance. So how did we get to this point, Dugal, where the shadow healthcare system was able to pop up, especially when some of us, I mean, I think about how much I'm paying for my health insurance. It's tens of thousands of dollars out of my paycheck because I have dependents, as do you. And yet, I'm one of the growing number of people that gets my healthcare in the shadow system. So talk to me about kind of this dual system that we now have and your thoughts on how it emerged and why.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think of it more as a convergence of a few different waves happening around the same time, both from the supply side and the demand side. So it feels like this sort of zeitgeist around wanting to be more in control of your health and willing to spend much more on a cash basis for those things sort of came out of nowhere. But I actually think it's more of a release of something that was pent up for decades and growing in this country, but now is able to be expressed because of the sorts of companies that can be built now that couldn't have been built even 10 years ago. So if you unpack that a little bit and think, what are those underlying trends? I think there's certainly a clear cultural shift we've seen coming out of COVID, triggered by COVID, but then accelerating in people understanding the different life outcomes and the different effects and trajectories they'll be on given their health status at any sort of point in time. So I think just spending that difficult few years surrounded by all sorts of conversations around health really got a lot of people thinking more deeply around their own situation and things they can do to take control. So I think that's one part of it. But then I think alongside that, you also see this cultural trend where health has become lifestyle, status, aspirational. It's become a cool conversation to be in for a lot of people. And it's a little bit chicken and egg, whether is that social media driving that? Is social media just the megaphone that kind of expresses that cultural trend? Doesn't really matter. The point is that people have started to really see being healthy as core to their lifestyle and core to their aspirations in the way that probably many people didn't even 10 years ago. And then at the same time, you now have the ability to build a company that can make proactive health and longevity services available in a more convenient, more cost-effective, and hopefully more trustworthy way now than you could 10 years ago. So it's sort of, I think, this pent-up frustration that people have had around not having enough of the right solutions to actively manage their health, combined with more and more people taking that very seriously, and now a set of companies that make it available and more accessible to folks that would have otherwise been sort of shut out of the market for things that were very expensive or only available in a few cities.
Yeah, so many threads that I want to pull there, including on this kind of big question that you and I have been talking about behind the scenes of like the difference between longevity and prevention, and is there even a difference? And we definitely need to get into that. But before we do, I wanted to just admit that last night I went out to see a show in Manhattan, and after the show I had like I would say 1.5 cocktails, which for me is quite a lot because I'm not too much of a drinker. It was kind of an abnormal night. But I woke up in the morning and the first thing I did is I looked at my Aura app because I have one of these rings now. And it told me that I did not sleep that well and that my heart rate was up overnight. And it was just, I knew I kind of didn't sleep that well. And I did wake up sort of feeling the effects. But seeing it like that, it's been driving me more and more to abstain because I don't like seeing that I didn't sleep well. And it sort of leaves me with this feeling all day of like, okay, I'm maybe less ready and maybe less prepared than I could have been otherwise. And yet, plenty of physicians and scientists and public health experts have been saying for a long time that alcohol is bad. I think Vivek Murthy said there's no amount of good alcohol, like it's just net bad. So why do you think this N of one message, the aura message, seems to be resonating more than just having a really smart, educated physician type person telling you the same thing? Like, why do people seem to want to see it in the data?
Yeah, I think you're describing it in exactly the way we think about with the N of one. As wherever you can make something like that feel directly relevant and personal to the individual versus them feeling like they're receiving a population health guidance, I think that's just going to hit very differently. And I think when you combine that with the ability to hold up a mirror with some sort of data set and show people that this is real, this is happening inside your body, these are all the other effects of, that decision. Again, it makes it less abstract and I think makes it, for most people, something that they take much more seriously as well. So I think that's generally a good trend, although I will say that a counterpoint for this that maybe we'll talk about is, at what point does all of this get too extreme and end up kind of measuring the fun out of life to an extent? And so there's a balance to be struck. But I think people understanding not just that eating high glycemic index foods is generally not good for you, but actually let me show you your CGM of this specific food that you tend to eat every morning and what that does for you, and make that higher level message distilled down to a decision that you can actually make in your life every day. I think that leads to much higher compliance with the things that we've, in general, for a lot of these things, known were the right thing to do for a long time, but yet they tend to bounce off people.
I'm curious now that you've brought it up, if there have been any changes that you've made since you've been kind of more in the business of kind of doing the measurement. And then also, what have you not done, that you probably could have and optimize just that little bit more, but maybe you didn't do because, like you said, life is also supposed to be fun. And you know what? Like, I'm a mom of two young kids and I had a lot of fun last night with my cocktail and by the way, the show is Oh Mary and you guys have to go see it while it's still in Broadway. Hot tip. But yes, give me some of your own like personal changes and tell me about kind of the why or why not.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to stick with sleep, because you brought that up, it's obviously a very popular one. But for me specifically, I just didn't really think too much about sleep hygiene and sleep quality even a couple of years ago. And I totally believe that, in general, it was good to get high quality sleep, but I also had a lot of stuff going on. And, if I slept 6 hours, it was fine. I'd noticed I was a bit tired, but I wouldn't really think of it much more deeply than that. But as we actually have started to dig as a company much more into brain health and brain protection, and to see the link between sleep quality and the biomarkers associated with Alzheimer's and dementia, that's been a good example of when something moves from, accepted but not really that influential on the decisions I make to something that I've now prioritized as really, really important. So my dad has advanced dementia. I have some genetic predisposition to that, which I found through my diagnostics. And now I can clearly see where I move on the risk profile for Alzheimer's and dementia if I don't commit to sleeping well as much as I can. Now, that doesn't mean I won't still have a fun night. I think it's important to do that for sure. But it's an example of something that's moved from, again, one of these, you should sleep more level things in my mind to when push comes to shove, that's going to be something I prioritize doing well because I worry about brain protection. I worry about Alzheimer's and dementia risk, and I want to do everything I can to minimize that.
Yeah. And to that point, I mean, I think one of the interesting reasons to kind of ask people about the personal health decisions they've made is that a lot of my friends are physicians, and on a population level basis, like a lot of them are quite skeptical about what companies like yours are doing. They're saying, more data isn't necessarily good. It's going to drive a lot of anxiety and incidentalomas and people getting tests and procedures and things that they don't need. Or, it's not evidence-based or it's risky. And I think, all of that, you take it on a case-by-case basis. But a lot of them also, my physician friends are like microdosing GLP-1s and taking metformin. And a lot of them, honest to God, look fantastic, have lost a substantial amount of weight and seem to be glowing. And some of them are taking testosterone and, we can talk about all these things. But there is definitely a trend amongst the physicians I know to be saying one thing on a population level and then doing another thing when it comes to themselves. And I'd love to hear what you think about that because I'm sure you've seen it as well.
Definitely. And not to name names, but we have a lot of clinicians as members for sure. And they're always really interesting conversations because obviously, clinicians as members bring in a lot of institutional knowledge, obviously a fluency that the average member doesn't have. But it's also pretty eye-opening sometimes to understand the sort of depth in particular areas that some folks have, but, the lack of confidence they have outside of that and the desire for, partners to help them think through what they should be doing to manage their own bodies as well. And by the way, I'm not a clinician. This is not me making these decisions. This would be our own clinical team. But, I had a text from a fairly senior person in a major health system asking me about a particular peptide the other day. And obviously that was referred into the folks who can help them understand that at Lifeforce. But I definitely agree with you. There's a bit of, do as I say, not as I do within this. We are certainly on the side of if you want to know about things and if there's actions you want to take, then we think you should be empowered to do that with the right sort of support and interpretation and education about those things as well. So, the debate around should we give people access to their own data, almost like can people handle the truth? Is this going to create a lot of anxiety? I understand those arguments, but I think that as a company operating in the longevity medicine space, we have a responsibility to couple that with the right way to interpret the data, the right support to know what to actually do about it. And if you can bring those things all together, then we definitely land on the side of you should be able to know. And, it shouldn't be up to us to be the filter for what you understand about your body.
Yeah, so, I'm somebody who's a bit of a guinea pig and I've tried a lot of things, put it that way. Usually the one to sort of raise my hand and say, okay, the whole body MRI done, like just did the Neco scan over in Sweden. I've been in this industry a long time and I love trying stuff. So, of all these things, like you can take the whole body of them. And I've often asked myself, what have I actually found out about my health that I couldn't have found out anywhere else? And the answer is, not a ton, but I'll give you three things that I learned. One is that I have PCOS, another that I have scoliosis, and then from a whole body MRI, and this is quite personal, but I learned that my IUD was in the wrong place. So these are all things that I don't think the traditional health system does a great job of informing people on. The scoliosis thing actually came up earlier because I was getting surgery and it was a spinal. And because of the scoliosis, they had a really hard time with the spinal. And I had to go through quite a bit of pain and discomfort because nobody knew I had scoliosis. And the PCOS thing didn't come up until my struggles with having kids. And the IUD thing, like, thank God it came up. They may not be cancer diagnoses, they may not be, life or death situations, but these are the kinds of insights that I do think that there is value in having. And I think they are the kind of insights that the population level healthcare system doesn't do a good job surfacing. So, yeah, I'd be curious if, you mentioned one of yours, which is really the increased Alzheimer's risk, which maybe you would have found out because of your family history. But do you see those sorts of things all the time where you are able to find things that, again, not life or death, but of immense value to a patient to know, from reasons related to quality of life through pain management, through having the family that you want to have?
We do, for sure. I mean, your examples, they are three very real and very important examples. And I don't think there's anything about any of those that would be considered fringe or not important for you to understand. So obviously great that you as a consumer are able to get what you need to understand those things. Short answer to your question is yes, we do. And we find those things in sort of two different time horizons as well. There's finding the trends that people need to be paying attention to much earlier than they would otherwise have their attention drawn to those things. And again, these are often core health outcomes that we're talking about as well. So 26% of our members, for example, are pre-diabetic. And most of the time when we have that conversation with people, it's a surprising conversation for them and not something they've been paying attention to. And it's not uncommon for these folks to have gone through annual physicals in a traditional primary care environment for the last 10 or 15 years and also never have had that brought up to them. And so it's very sort of validated for us to plot forward the trend they're on and the speed they're progressing and be able to understand when they are likely to become diabetic and also what they can do now to stop that actually playing out. So understanding trends and really moving the time of intervention much further forward in people's lives or early in people's lives is, one of the most valuable things that we can be doing for our members. At the same time, because of the amount of information we're collecting, so we are doing 70 biomarker blood tests every 3 months. We're collecting 100 questions of patient-reported outcomes. We're looking at people's wearables information. Because we're in that position, we also find things that are much more acute and serious fairly regularly. And now, obviously, it's still a relatively small proportion of membership, but I was emailing with one of our members last week who had a elevated IGF-1 result, which is a hormone biomarker, that stayed elevated for 2 quarters. We asked him to investigate that with his PCP. His PCP wasn't fluent in that biomarker, honestly wasn't that interested in digging into that. So then we helped him to connect with a neurologist. Turns out he has a pituitary brain tumor. He had an operation on that 2 weeks later, and his symptoms now, are in much better place than they were before. So obviously that's a dramatic example, but just to kind of illustrate the point of this sort of more intensive ongoing monitoring that's holding the bar not at is something clearly broken, but what are the things that could be better or what are the things that don't look like they're in the green zone and let's dig into that is very important for people who want to be on the front foot.
Yeah, so I think I agree with all of that. And I think there are clearly kind of things that are not investigated in the system that we have because of just the 8-minute visits and all the problems that I think are well documented. And a lot of people are also just not going to get primary care these days, which is another issue that we could talk about. But at the same time, I think, what you can say about these approaches is that there is some amount of equitability, if that's the right word. It's, they are more equitable in the sense that it's geared towards being insurance covered and people can afford generally to go, whereas Lifeforce is expensive. So what are your thoughts on just being able to get into the populations that really, really need this? And you did say 26% is pre-diabetic, so it's not the worried well, which I think is a common criticism that you hear of this space that you're treating. At the same time, there's so many people that can't afford it that would like to have access to something like a Lifeforce. So what's your vision there?
So when we unpack who is actually signing up for Lifeforce and what does our membership look like, there's obviously the age and the geographic, et cetera, but In terms of health status and psychographics, there's really three tribes of folks that we see. There's certainly a group that we would classify as health optimizers, who are, for the most part, generally worried well, but these are people who already spend a lot of time and money on this. For them, staying healthy is a lifestyle. They're good members. We love working with them, but that only represents like a relatively small subset of our population. We also have a big group of people who are health motivated, but for different reasons have not been able to take care of themselves like they want to, in the last however many years. So these are folks who, might have considered themselves healthy, kind of more engaged in their health earlier in life, but then things have gotten in the way. They know they could be doing better. They have a lot of stuff going on, and now they want support to get back on track. And that's probably the largest cohort of folks who come to us. And when we start working with those sorts of people, inevitably there's a lot of things that we need to draw their attention to that we can get started working on. And then there's also a third group of folks who have not ever really identified as particularly health motivated, but want to reinvent themselves, want to draw a line in the sand and start prioritizing their health in a different way. Often that's because there's a specific trigger, like death of a family member, or maybe turning a certain age, or having a child, that makes them just really want to think differently. And they're quite overwhelmed and intimidated by how to do that. And so they want a partner that gives them more confidence that they'll be successful. So none of those tribes are exclusive to a particular income level as well. Those are pretty universal subsets of people. So 100% aligned with you that the goal here is to continually find ways to make the front door to this sort of proactive health management wider so that more people can access it. And so, we think and hope that over time, this category actually ends up more integrated with the traditional healthcare system, including more integrated with reimbursement. So that's certainly the path we're on. That's the agenda we want to drive. We think that as much as possible, if people can get things covered by insurance, they should be able to do that, and the companies in this space should help them do that as well. And then there'll always be another set of things that, where we want to create early access to things that are more leading edge that will take time to make their way into insurance. So I hope that there's a bit of a waterfall that happens here where, over time, the kind of scope of what's considered coverable continues to expand. And at the same time, there's a pipeline of new interventions, new diagnostics that are always being validated that we can provide people access to much earlier than they would get in a traditional primary care environment. So that's one way that I think and hope this becomes structurally more available over time. And then I think from a product perspective, the way we increasingly use our AI tools in partnership with our clinicians to create cheaper and more accessible tiers of Lifeforce is pretty exciting to us as well. We have, up until now, I had the sort of V1 version of the model, which is clinically intensive. It's very hands-on. But as we roll out more of that tooling, I think there's a chance to still keep a lot of that value, but create a cost structure that means that it's not unrealistic to think of folks having a longevity partner in their ecosystem for $40 a month instead of $140 a month.
So just to kind of shift gears a little bit, put on my VC hat, how do you think about this LTV problem? Because that's always my big question when I look at businesses like yours, is that oftentimes there is a testing component, and that test might feel to people that it's a one-time thing. Or you just fix something and they say, okay, I'm cured, and go away, and that's it. And I think that's where you see companies like Function Health and others really pushing into this idea of like keep coming back every 3 months and get retested. And they try to tie that to the clinical model and to clinical outcomes that are valuable for people. But at the end of the day, it's an LTV. The reasoning is the LTV problem that every VC would want to kind of have a real kind of story around in order to invest. And they need to believe that it can get better over time. So how do you think about that? Because there is, in theory, it's sort of like dating apps. Like if you meet somebody, then you never use the app again. And therefore, like it's the fundamental flaw of dating apps. If you guys succeed and you get somebody healthy, again, is there a similar kind of issue there at the heart of these companies that if you get somebody better, it's like, it's the equivalent of, finding them a spouse. They don't need to use you anymore. And yet it's expensive to acquire these patients. So kind of walk me through the thinking there.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into our thinking and what we've learned on that. And I think one of the big distinctions is are you building a solution that actually will deliver the outcomes that people will value and that will drive stickiness? Or, are you giving them things or insights that are, novel and have some value initially, but then, might lead to kind of staleness or people churning? So obviously we are on the side of actually intervening, actually providing the therapies, actually, really selling a more longitudinal journey of fixing things and improving things and helping you to kind of show you the data that those things are working over time versus insights on their own. But within that, there's also a lot that we've learned and continue to learn around how to think about goals, how to think about behavior change, how much can people actually digest at any one point in time, and how do you sort of use all of that to create an experience that stays fresh and prolongs engagement. So, for example, over time, we've actually sort of progressively moved to a less is more approach on how we build programs for our members. So, instead of giving people 200 biomarkers and recommendations on every possible front, we're much more now in the experience of we're going to really curate and isolate the one or two things that are going to be most important for you over the next 3 months. And let's really get everything focused on that. And then we'll move on to the next goal. Or if we're not where we want to be, we'll learn how your body responds and tweak the program and turn up the horsepower on different things. So I think sort of level one is, are you selling insights or are you selling outcomes? Level two is, how do you create the UX so that it stays fresh, stays engaging, doesn't feel repetitive to people? But then I think also sitting around this is, how do you understand and lean into the natural sort of psychology and behaviors that people will have about a solution like this? So for example, what we see is people often are in either a more intensive kind of optimization mindset and zone, or they're in a maintenance zone as well. And trying to keep people in that more intensive optimization zone for too long just is sort of swimming against the tide in how people feel about these solutions. So, we provide the ability to toggle up and down. So we have a maintenance tier of membership and we have a full tier of membership. So by doing that, I think we can end up in a position that's more like a financial advisor versus, mint.com, where we're tracking what's happening in your body. We're able to actually kind of intervene as things continue to change, but you can toggle up and toggle down between those modes rather than feeling like at a certain point in time, things get a bit heavy for you if you're going to be in the full membership. The other thing that I think is interesting in the demographic that we focus on is that most of our members are between 40 and 60. So that's not by accident. It's a really interesting chapter of life where what's happening in your life actually changes, and logically what happens in your body changes as well. So, between 40 and 60, and obviously it's not like a hard cutoff, but this conversation around staying healthy goes to a whole other level and becomes something that people think about much more existentially. And then physiologically, and we see this in the data, there's a lot more changing and a lot more things to be paying attention to, which gives us much more shots on goal to do our jobs well and therefore drive better engagement and retention.
And of that demographic, what is the percentage that are men versus women?
45% female, 55% male.
So you're actually quite equal. But I have this perception, rightly or wrongly, that the longevity space seems more focused on men. I mean, I find a lot of the branding of these companies to be very male in its orientation. It seems like the influencers that are affiliated with these companies are also men and have audiences that are very heavy on men. Do you agree with that? And then how were you able to get to women? And what do you think is the different message that companies should be sharing in order to bring women into the fold on longevity, so that it doesn't just continue to be like a kind of older male thing, which it seems like it is now?
Yeah, I think I would agree with you overall, although I think we're seeing this start to evolve a bit in the category as a whole. But even just the fact that the biggest influencers and sort of public voices in the space, are probably 3/4 or more male, for sure, influencers that. But I also think that there's a lot of nuance in not sort of assuming that certain motivations are male motivations or female motivations as well. So as we've thought about how we develop the brand and how we talk about different things, rather than indexing hard, for example, on performance and that sort of angle, which is, where you see quite a lot of longevity brands head to, we try and focus more on life, what it means to live a life well, what are the things you care about in your life that would make you want to look after yourself and be proactive. So I think it requires a lot of thought and testing from a brand and messaging perspective. But I think often you'll find companies moving performance-y, which tends to generally be a more male sort of motivation, or very sort of wellness and health focused, which tends to skew more female. And I don't actually think you need to be as polarized as that. I think there's a way to tell the story in between, which is still talking a lot about the science and the metrics, because that's important, but wrapping it with more general humanity and things that are pretty universal for men and women as well. But underneath that, though, you asked about acquisition. There are certain conditions, there are certain symptoms, there are certain things that men and women are thinking about more or less than each other. So that's where you have to just build really good individual funnels on speaking into those more kind of specific things that might activate someone in the short term, but wrap that in a message that feels like it's built on stuff that's just universal for anyone who just wants to be proactive about their life.
Yeah, and I definitely think that there are ways in which you can kind of do sort of campaigns that specifically target men versus women. For instance, menopause is an area that I know you and I have talked about over the recent months, of just like there's clearly a need there, especially as you think about that 40 to 60-year-old segment. But I want to get into this question, I promised we would circle back to it, of the difference between longevity and prevention. Is longevity just a clever rebranding? And we had Jeff Wessler come on the pod recently, who's a cardiologist. He runs a company called Heartbeat Health, and I believe you know them well. They are really in the kind of cardiology prevention area. And I asked him this question, and he said, as a physician and public health researcher, I was trained on the idea that there are three types of prevention. There's primordial prevention, secondary, and tertiary prevention, which is essentially primordial is, I would assume you and we don't really have any kind of real heart health risks at this present moment, but there are things that we obviously could be doing to improve our heart health over time. And then there are people that, maybe in the secondary camp where they've got those strong risks of a cardiovascular event, like maybe they haven't yet kind of had a heart attack, but there's just a lot of risk factors. And then you've got people who have had heart attacks and really are thinking about how to not have another heart attack, and that these are all different types of prevention, right? It's not all kind of one thing. And he said, I actually think longevity is a rebrand of the first kind, primordial prevention, that for the first time has made available to people who weren't really thinking 20, 30 years down the line. Suddenly now they are, because like you said, you've been able to sort of show, in the trajectory that you're on, this is what could happen to you in the future. You change it with behavior change and whatnot, you could be on a totally different trajectory. And I think that appeals to people in some way. So I'd love to get your thoughts on kind of Jeff's kind of thinking on this topic. How does that sit for you? You may have heard him say something like this before, but what strikes you in that kind of thesis that he articulated?
Yeah, like you said, I've spent some time with Jeff. I think he's awesome, and I think their business is fantastic. So definitely align with how he's thinking about it. I think that the is longevity a rebranding of preventative health is sort of yes, but it's not just that. Within the definition of longevity, and it's honestly probably also important to even unbundle the word longevity at this point as well, because it's become such a zeitgeist that it's also kind of lost meaning to some extent, because you see everything from a company like us to a biotech company to a protein supplement, all described as longevity. So that's, maybe a different conversation to have. But I think there is a subset of the things we focus on as a longevity medicine company that are also just good, well-established preventative health techniques. And, in that way, it is sort of a rebranding of things that we've always known. But the question is, why is this working, and why is this driving engagement in a way that those preventative health programs never have in the past? And I think that is when you start to get into the other parts of what we are thinking about and doing, in good longevity medicine that are not part of traditional preventative health programs. And a lot of that often leads you into the area of quality of life and the things that are going to affect how people feel now, how well they function. And it's often those things we found that actually create the initial motivation to do something to choose a longevity partner and to start engaging proactively. And so by helping people with those things, it could be energy, it could be sleep quality, it could be libido, you actually earn trust and you demonstrate that you can fix things that then puts you in a position to influence people around other preventative health things that are just sort of core that we've known about. And so, getting a colonoscopy on time at 40 becomes, not something that your insurance company is sending you a postcard about. Now it's a longevity intervention as part of your longevity program that's also working with you on cognitive performance and energy levels as well. So it leads to just a totally different level of compliance and therefore we believe better outcomes. I think the other difference to Jeff's point is it's a conversation around time horizons. Like at what point are you actually measuring and intervening on the continuum of the trends that people should care about? And certainly the longevity philosophy is let's spot these things as early as we can and address them then, because that's the best way to make sure they don't become big problems in the future.
So you mentioned longevity is not all the same. To that point, a friend of mine just texted me a link to an article that came out in NBC News with the headline that there was a rise in liver injuries due to people taking supplements, not through the medical advice of their doctor. And as you know well, there are some really bad supplements out there. This is a space that is very underregulated, and therefore I've seen some crazy stuff in the supplements industry. A lot of claims that are not backed by evidence, and then just quality of ingredients, even like if you take it down to that level. And one could paint longevity with a bad brush and say there's just a lot of shilling of supplements through a lot of these companies. And I think we're starting to see the kind of real consequences. Like I said, these patients are suffering. So how do you think about kind of calling behavior like this out when you see it? And how do you think about kind of the supplement craze too? Like, do you think we're going to see the rise of, I'm thinking that we might see a movement that I'm calling data-driven supplements where like, if the FDA is not going to regulate it very much, like maybe the industry just kind of like maybe we all need to start regulating it in our own way. So yeah, have you yet kind of had that experience where you're like, I need to just call this out because this is like harmful to people and it's bad for you because it has the effect of kind of damaging the whole space?
Yeah, and I mean, I've been in this position as a consumer as well. This Lifeforce started from, in part, because of my own experience of wanting to do something to be more proactive, but really not knowing where to go or how to do it the right way. So ending up having a kind of spray or pray approach that a lot of folks still have around how to, spend money and time on trying to look after myself. So I totally agree. And I think that the boom in spending on supplements is a symptom of what I was describing at the start of the conversation around this sort of pent up desire to be proactive and do something, but people not having had access to something that's actually data driven and more focused on the goals they need. So overall, I think people are taking too many supplements. I think most of the supplements people take are not necessary. I think as a whole, anything that moves us towards proper data and feedback loops to show people what they need and whether or not those things is working is a really good trend. And this is coming from a company that does a lot of things, has supplements as well. And what we often find when people come to us is we start by really auditing and reconciling what are they taking, where do they hear about that thing, why are they taking it, how does it make sense for the goals they have, and ultimately streamlining a lot of things for people as well. And so I totally agree with you. I don't think it's ever realistic to think that you're going to get to, a perfect level of kind of attribution of this supplement moved this biomarker, but I think we can get much higher than the industry is so far at the moment. And I think that's why having something that's more of like the platform that's creating that data and sort of helping you understand X moved Y is a really important thing. And so I hope over time that more and more people go from that kind of scattergun approach to spending money on high quality things that they can explain coherently are linked to the goals that are significant for them.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it sounds like you might also be on board to support this data-driven supplements movement that I'm excited to see happen. So I'm going to end things, Dugal, with a quick round that we often end the podcast with. And it's a little game I like to call Overhyped, Underhyped, or just hyped enough. So I'm going to throw out a trend in healthcare or tech, and you can answer with one of the three. And if you want to provide like a short and sweet explanation, feel free to, but you don't have to. You could just land overhyped and we can quickly move on. But it's just something fun, and wanted to see if you're up for it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so GLP-1s.
Underhyped.
Okay, I need to know. You got to tell me. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's plenty of hype, but I think the underhyped part of it is you touched on it at the start around the use cases for GLP-1, based on the research we understand at the moment for things outside of weight loss as well. So even when you think about Alzheimer's and dementia risk, microdosing of GLP-1s and different sort of dosages and use cases there, really exciting early data around how that can be powerful. So I don't think it's underhyped in that sort of core conversation about weight loss, but I think it might be underhyped in some of those other categories where those sorts of molecules could be really interesting.
The consumerization of healthcare.
Just the right amount of hype.
Okay, interesting. AI in healthcare.
Underhyped.
Okay, I'm interested in that. We'll have to come back and find some time to talk about it. Hospital at home.
I think underhyped as well. Somewhere between just the right amount of hype and underhyped. Yeah, I think it has huge potential, and I think it has interaction with AI as well. So I'll go with underhyped on that one.
The role of venture capital in healthcare.
Just the right amount of hype.
And last one, telemedicine.
I'd say underhyped at the moment, because I think you've seen it's sort of a moment in time thing where I think the pendulum swung both ways here, and obviously COVID times was hype max around this, and then I think there's now been a level of sort of pessimism around telehealth and what it's able to provide, et cetera, that I think is a bit overdone. I think it depends on the model. I think tele-urgent, I understand the sort of skepticism around that, but I think that's not really fully appreciating the whole landscape of clinical models that can really integrate telehealth well.
I think that's interesting. We might be in kind of a Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3 thing. And, I think there's something there that we've seen a generation of telemedicine companies go to scale, but the next generation seems to be kind of learning from a lot of those mistakes. And I'm kind of more excited about that in the years to come. So with that, I will say thank you so much for joining us on the pod. I hope that you will come back. We'll have to have you on next year and we can just catch up on how things have been going. But just really appreciate your honesty, candor, and really thoughtfulness on this topic. And yeah, if folks have any questions for you, want to reach out, what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, I'd always love to talk to people. You can find me on LinkedIn and shoot me a direct message, or if you're curious about the company, it's mylifeforce.com. So I just think it's such a interesting.
So you heard it here. You can slide into his DMs. So thanks everybody. See you next time. Thank you for tuning in to Second Opinion. If you got value out of this conversation, please share it with colleagues and Slack groups and friends navigating the industry. If you haven't already checked out the Second Opinion newsletter, you will get a link to subscribe in the episode description. Second Opinion is a part of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Econ 102 with Noah Smith, Turpentine VC, Complex Systems with Patrick McKenzie, and more shows for experts by experts in tech.